Sounds good. Hi, everyone. Our presenter is having a bit of a difficult time getting logged in, so give us just a moment as they get logged in.
Alexa, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Welcome, welcome. I was giving you a moment to get settled. But today, thank you everybody for joining. Benjamin, will you help to ensure that Kyle can share his screen?
Alexa, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, it took me a second, and you may have to give me a second because my dogs are
Absolutely.
going crazy and my typical microphone isn't working for some reason. So give me just 1 second.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everybody for joining as Kyle gets set up and Benjamin helps to ensure that he can share his screen. Um, Today we are going to talk about database individualization, and Kyle Allen is from the American Institutes for Research, or AIR. And AIR supports two different kind of entities here. We have the National Center for Intensive Intervention, of which DBI kind of lives within that realm under that branch of AIR. And then we also have under AIR is the Center for the MTSS Center. AIR has been a great support in our work and in how we have supported our districts with SPDEG and within the state. And so we're really excited that Kyle is here to give us an overview of DBI and additional places that we can find more information regarding DBI. So as he gets settled here, we'll get started.
I think I have about figured this out. Let me try to share my screen here. I appreciate y'all's patience.
Yes, we can see it.
All right, great. So I have to tell you all, my wife takes my kids to school, and that just so happens to coincide with her getting back home right at 9 o'clock, which means my dogs usually go haywire. And I usually combat this with a set of noise canceling headphones that for some reason I could not get to connect this morning. So anywho, my understanding is I have an hour with you all. So Alexa, if I'm incorrect about that, let me know.
That is
But
correct.
all right, great. But I'm just extremely excited to talk with you all today. I actually took from the slide deck that we presented at OSDE around basically an introduction to DBI. So if you're not familiar with DBI, DBI stands for Data-Based Individualization. We're going to unpack a lot of that today. But the reason I wanted to take so heavily from the slide deck that we presented at the State Department simply is because I strongly believe in a common language. I strongly believe in a common foundation. And so I want you all to know on the call today that everything that you're hearing today is exactly what was presented to the leaders within our state. Okay. So we can jump into this, yeah, and we'll try to unpack DBI in an hour. All right. Okay, so I think mainly, as far as learner outcomes go, I really wanted you all to think about the rationale for intensive intervention. That's really what DBI is centered around. Again, we're going to talk a lot about that. I think more than anything, though, I want you just to have a kind of foundational, elementary understanding of the steps involved in the DBI process, okay? There's 5 steps there, and we're going to get to all of them. and I think as you continue to work in the state of Oklahoma, I heard Alexa as I was fumbling with my technology, briefly mention some of the opportunities that are going to be, coming up in the state, working OSDE, working with AIR, and you're going to hear a lot come from the State Department around DBI. And so my hope is, as we look at the 5 steps today, it'll really just be a foundation that you can build on as you move through working in the state. The other thing that's always really important to me is that you walk away knowing about the National Center on Intensive Intervention. So this is a good time to tell you that this training, this presentation is through the National Center on Intensive Intervention, or NCII. It is basically operated by AIR, the American Institutes for Research, and we are funded through OSEP. And so some people say what we do is free, and I think that's incorrect. What we do is paid through tax dollars. Okay, so it technically is at no cost to the end user, but there's certainly a lot of funding that goes into doing the work that we do. So those are some of my learner outcomes. Hopefully we'll achieve those today. Okay. So the first thing I really wanted to jump into was this introduction to intensive intervention. So I think in this section, my goal is to really make the case for why intensive intervention is necessary, perhaps why it's important. Okay. And my hope is, as we go through some of these slides, these will resonate with you. These will sound like situations that you yourself deal with in schools, and I think it'll set the stage for why a process like data-based individualization is important for schools. All right. Okay, so we always kind of start with this question: why do we need intensive intervention? And the truth is, you all know this, but it's important to say over and over again that students with disability have a history of poor outcomes in several areas, okay, especially compared to their peers without disabilities. So as you all know, some of these show up in academic achievement, high school completion. Something that I'm very passionate about is post-secondary education, employment, and then oftentimes involvement with the criminal justice system. All right. So what we know then about why we need intensive intervention are kind of 3 things here. All right. And I like to go through these because I think, again, it really tells us why DBI can be important. All right. So we do know through research, these are all of these statements are backed up by research. Okay. So validated programs are not universally effective programs. We know through research that 3 to 5% of students need more help. And frankly, what I've seen in schools in my history and working in schools, it's oftentimes more than that, right? But I think that already tells us, right? If you break that down, a validated program is not universally effective. Well, if that's true, then that already kind of makes the case for needing to intensify and needing to individualize some of these programs that we utilize with students, right? So we need a system to do that, and that's what DPI does, all right? This middle one, I think, will resonate, a lot with you all. Students with intensive needs often require 10 to 13 times as much practice as their peers to learn new information. Again, my background's in school psychology, but I do have a history of working directly with students as well, that have severe persistent needs, and this resonates to me, knowing that a lot of the students I worked with need a lot of repetition, need a lot of practice. And you'll see that DBI allows for that. All right. And then for students with intensive needs, co-occurring academic and behavioral needs are the rule, not the exception. Again, a lot of the time I spent in schools, oftentimes we have students who are behind, perhaps even requiring specialized education, because they oftentimes spend time outside of school, whether that's through, expulsion, or, perhaps it's, other behavior needs that don't allow them to make it to school because of, outside extraneous factors, right? So we know that these things co-occur, okay? And DBI also accounts for that as well. So intensive intervention addresses severe and persistent learning and behavioral difficulties, right? So when we look at all of what research says about students that have intensive needs, we know that something like intensive intervention can really combat that, right? Two things that are really critical to me about intensive intervention, and this is likely my school psychology brain, but they really need to be driven by data, right? We're going to talk a lot about that. Data needs to drive much of the decision making through this process, okay? And then the other thing is intensive intervention is really characterized by increased intensity and individualization. So as we work through this process of DBI, what we're really doing is allowing the data to really drive that increased intensity, really drive that increased individualization process. All right. So this is just, a couple bullet points about what intensive intervention is and what it is not. I like this slide because I think, if you're somebody who really just kind of wants a summary, this is a good summary slide. All right. It's going to tell you, kind of the nuts and bolts or kind of the big pieces of what intensive intervention is and what it isn't. Okay. So intensive intervention is a process, okay? So what it's not then is a one-time fix, right? You're going to see there's 5 steps to this intensive intervention process that we call DBI, excuse me. So it's not something that you're going to do with a student one time and everything's going to kind of magically be better. I used to always say as a school psychologist that, would do MEGS and run a lot of eligibility meetings, and you all know this, I'm sure, but, to parents, sometimes I feel like we needed to tell them, just because we're putting a student on an IEP, that doesn't come with a magic wand. That means, a month from now that, everything's going to be better. They're going to be completely caught up and not need the IEP anymore, right? Like there's still a lot of work that's involved with this, if you will. Intensive intervention is individualized based on student needs. Okay. And the way that we capture that is through data collection. All right. And that's why it's data driven. And we're going to talk a lot about that as well. More intense, often with substantially different content and pedagogy. So really what that means is there's a step within DBI where we would look at adapting an intervention, right? And so if we have data that says a student is not making progress, then we would then use that data to determine what type of adaptation. And typically that might look at, adapting the content, adapting the pedagogy, it could look like a lot of different things, okay? It's a process that involves more frequent and precise progress monitoring. All right. We're going to talk a lot about progress monitoring. We talk a lot about progress monitoring through the resources on our website. If we have time, I'll drag over my browser and show you guys the website and how to get there and all the resources that are provided at no cost to you all. Let's see. And then lastly, it's an approach that integrates academic and behavioral supports. So again, we talked briefly about that, but we know research says that these things co-occur, right? And they often impact each other. And so there has to be a plan to account for that, all right? So briefly, what intensive intervention is not. We talked about how it's not a one-time fix, right? It's definitely a process. It's certainly not a single approach. Oftentimes it takes adapting, like I mentioned, a lot of the things that we do that perhaps we're familiar with. And that's just, a commitment to looking at data and letting data drive the work that you do, okay? It's certainly not a manual. It's not a preset program. It's not a curriculum. It's not, it's not a single thing, right? It's really a process of delivering intensive intervention to our students. All right. It's not more of the same tier one instruction. So if you're familiar with RTI or an MTSS framework, DBI is not just, giving them more of the core curriculum over and over and over and over, until they still don't get it, right? And it's not more of the same tier two instruction either, okay? All right, so who needs intensive intervention? Typically students with disabilities who are not making adequate progress in their current instructional program and not meeting individualized education program, those IEP goals, right? And I would beg, or I would imagine, I should say, that we all know a student like that, right? So if you're asking yourself, is DBI something that could impact my work? I think you can ask yourself, do you work with a student who is identified as having a disability and not making adequate progress? And if your answer to that is yes, then my response to you would be, then DBI is something that could be beneficial to you, all right? Students with persistently low academic achievement and or high frequency and or high intensity behaviors. Okay, so again, likely know some of those friends, I'm sure. And then we talk about too how DBI can really elevate, give context to a tiered intervention program, a multi-tiered system of supports or response intervention, and basically a tiered response, I should say tiered framework. Typically students that are receiving interventions who are non-responsive to those interventions when they're delivered with fidelity are students who need intensive intervention. All right. Okay. I want to share this slide because I think it's really critically important to really knowing that there's research that says that there are benefits to DBI. Okay. And so, my thought is, as we set this stage for unpacking DBI, which is what we're going to move to in just a moment, we've already, I think, identified some students that we perhaps know that would benefit from DBI. So I think one last thing we have to ask ourselves is DBI worth it, right? I mean, is this really impactful? Because anything that we do in school with the limited resources that we have, better give us a bang for our buck, right? It better provide some type of results. And if it doesn't, then, my thought would be, then we shouldn't do it. And so I do want to share with you some research that's come out about the benefits of intensive intervention. I'll butcher this if I don't just read it directly to you, but after I do, we'll unpack it a little bit. If you're visual, on the left, there's a graph, and so we can kind of look at that and what that means, okay? So this is a quote from a school district in Rhode Island that we work with through NCII. And it says, in 1 year, 78% of students receiving intervention reached ambitious growth goals set using national norms. 30% of students were exited from any kind of intervention, okay? So let's compare that to this graph over here on the left, okay? So this is says improves outcomes for K-12 students at or below the 10th percentile, okay? So we were looking at students who function in that well below average range. These are typically students who likely would receive IEP services, okay? And so what we're doing is we're comparing two things here. One, we're comparing, I guess we're not really comparing reading and math. We're looking at reading and math, but we're comparing the results or the years of growth for typical instruction. And then, so there was a group of students that just received what we would consider typical instruction. And then there's a group of students that received DBI, that intensive intervention approach. Okay. And what you can see, I think pretty clearly, the blue lines are the results of the students that received DBI. Okay. So you can see that they outgrew students that did not receive DBI in both reading and in math. Okay. So this is just one of several studies that really indicate that DBI is impactful. Okay. All right. I just have a couple more slides here on setting the stage, and then I think, probably what you all really want to move into is, okay, what is DBI? And we'll try to spend most of our time there. But I always want to really make educators feel like before we get to what DBI is, to really understand why it's important, okay? So where does intensive intervention fit within a multi-tiered system of support? I always tell people it really fits within tier 2 and tier 3. To me, if you're ever working with a student in some sort of individual fashion, right? So oftentimes at tier 2, I should say, we're working with groups of students. But it's not totally unusual at tier 2 to work individually. Obviously at tier 3, and then even moving into students that are receiving special education services formally through an IEP, obviously very individualized at that point, and therefore DBI is something that absolutely makes a lot of sense in those cases. Okay, I think we can skip this slide. This is just kind of the comparison of tier 2 and tier 3. It's really, like I said, a lot of tier 2 is group. So we talk about group size here, 3 to 7 students. At tier 2, where at tier 3, it becomes more individualized. Okay, and then I really wanted to hit lastly on how does intensive intervention relate to special education, as I think that really pertains to our group today. So you all know students with disabilities are required to have access to intensive intervention through IDEA. Many students who require intensive intervention also are students with disabilities, right? So they've already been identified, and so we know that. Intensive intervention can help educators design and deliver special education programming. We actually have an entire presentation that a colleague of mine and myself did at CEC, if you're familiar with the Council for Exceptional Children, that's all around utilizing DBI to design and deliver SDI, specially designed instruction. So certainly is the case there where DBI can almost help you navigate that IEP process. And I'll point you in the direction to that if we have enough time at the end of this. DBI should be part of the educational program for students with disabilities, not a separate process, right? So much like we talk about with MTSS, DBI really should fit into what you're already doing. I think our goal at NCII is to never have anybody walking away feeling like DBI is another thing. It's not. It's really a culmination. It's a systematic process to what you're already doing. It's just kind of naming those things and almost like creating a protocol, if you will, of how we're working with students already. So hopefully nobody feels like anybody's asking you to do like a bunch of new stuff today. And then in schools implementing MTSS, students with disabilities may receive components of their intensive intervention across those different levels or tiers of support. Okay. I'm going to take a drink of my coffee because I've been talking a lot, but I want to give you guys, 10 to 15 seconds to just think, digest. I don't know. I'm assuming, Alexa, they can't come off mute and chime in or ask questions. If not, that's okay. But I typically
We can change that.
I think it's okay. I mean, are they able to put anything in the chat?
I think so.
Feel free if you have any questions or thoughts, comments. I'm a big feedback person. I don't typically like just talking at people. It kind of feels weird because I don't really know if anybody's even really out there. One time my son, who was at home, came into my office and asked me why I was talking to myself. And I said, well, it does kind of feel like that sometimes, but there's actually people on the other end of this technology that I hope are listening. Yeah, so if you have comments, thoughts, questions, I guess, Alexa, if you want to open it up, you can. I'm happy to do that. I mean, I know we're on a short time frame, so if it gets out of control, we can, limit that. But I'm happy to always take questions. I always like when people jump in. And if your, means of doing that is through the chat, I mean, I think that's totally acceptable as well. So
the chat is open, and then everyone has the ability to do video and unmute.
I appreciate that, Alexa. Now my son won't think I have schizophrenia. All right.
Alexa and Kyle, good morning. This is Karen Mock.
Hey, Karen.
And actually, my chat is not working. Just FYI.
Okay, it may have recently been changed, so I don't know if you can try it again, Karen, and if not, no big deal. We know you'll chime in if you need to. Okay, all right. Well, as you can see, I love when people chime in, so feel free to do that anytime. You can always interrupt me too. All right, so hopefully we set the stage for why we need DBI. Now we got to quickly unpack what it is. So I'm going to do that. I want to leave about 10 minutes, perhaps to ask questions. I think Alexa may have some, but also if anyone else in the group would have some questions, I'd be happy to answer those as well. All right. Okay. So what is DBI? DBI, as we've kind of already unpacked, is a research-based process. I wish we could make process like the biggest font that we could that could still fit on this slide, because that's really what it is. It's a process, okay, for individualizing and intensifying interventions for students with severe and persistent learning and behavioral needs. The process integrates a lot of things, namely evidence-based intervention, assessment, as well as strategies. Okay, now again, if you're visual like me, one thing that you're going to see throughout these next couple slides is this, I guess it's an infographic, is what you might call it, but it really just is a process. It's an infographic that shows the DBI process that I actually really like. I'm also very visual, so that's probably why I like it. But I'll call out certain things about this infographic as we continue to unpack these 5 steps DBI. Okay. I always like to just call this out. A lot of people ask, do I need a DBI team to implement DBI? So I just made a slide that says no. Individual teachers can independently implement DBI. Okay. However, we always say that 3 or more heads are always better than 1 when engaging in problem solving. Okay. Because one part of DBI is really, it's twofold. It's problem identification, but then it's problem analysis, which I think is more important than problem identification, right? So an example of that might be, well, we were actually talking about problem identification and problem analysis at the OKMTSS Winter Conference when our projector right in the middle of my presentation shut down. And I said, this is perfect, right? Like we all can identify that the projector is not working. So that's problem identification. Now, collectively, can any of us really analyze why that happened? And I mean, frankly, none of us could. But it was really funny because then a tech guy came in and he said, well, I'm going to go run a diagnostic. And I was like, oh my God, this is perfect, because that really fits in with what you would do in this DBI process as well. So as you all know, when we really start to, analyze, what perhaps might be working or not working, it's always better to have a team, right? That's really what I'm trying to mention through this slide, if you will. Okay, really quickly, I just want to say this, and then we're going to get into these actual steps, okay? I like this slide as a school psychologist because I think DBI helps us do 2 things. It helps us refer and meet those eligibility requirements for students that perhaps need special education services. So it does these things. It ensures provision of intensive interventions to rule out lack of instruction. If you've ever been in a MEGS meeting, you know that we're required to do that. If we can't do that, then we don't know if a child really truly has a disability. DBI allows us to say that it's not because of lack of instruction. In fact, we've provided very intensive research-based interventions with fidelity. And so it can't be because they're not getting something that's good. Provides formal progress monitoring data that can be shared with parents. That data can also be used to determine if they're a responder, a non-responder, therefore perhaps may have a learning disability or some other type of disability. And then it allows us to compare students' performance to performance of peers. Okay, so that's the eligibility requirement. So DBI allows us to do that, but it also allows us to then develop and implement an IEP. And that's really that whole presentation I was talking about that's around DBI to design and deliver SDI. Okay, so provides data to develop present levels of academic achievement and functional performance statements. It allows us to set ambitious, realistic IEP goals and monitor progress towards these goals. Develop specially designed instruction, and then provide estimates of level of service needed. Okay. So again, DBI can really help us do a lot of the things that we're already asked or required to do as educators who work with students that have intensive needs. So that's good. All right, so here's the actual DBI process with the steps, okay? I'm not going to name these steps right now because all of my slides that follow this are going to walk through all of these, okay? So my goal is to spend about 20 minutes on these 5 steps, give or take, and then hopefully have about 10 minutes for questions, okay? All right, so the first step of DBI is really laying the foundation for database individualization, okay? So step 1 is starting with a standardized, validated intervention program, okay? So you can see that looks like maybe a couple different things, right? Perhaps it's a tier 2 intervention that we typically would provide to a student that has a specific skill deficit, okay? The key there is that it's validated, though. Okay, I've got some slides. This is my favorite slide of all time. Hopefully you guys have a sense of humor similar to mine. If not, you may not think it's funny. But I get this question a lot, and it says, can I still implement DBI if I don't have a standardized evidence-based program? And so this is a quote from a made-up teacher. It's a made-up quote from a made-up teacher. And it says, I can tell you're struggling with fractions, Tony, but there aren't any evidence-based practices for kids in your grade. Maybe check back in a few years, okay? And every time I read that, I chuckle a little bit because I think maybe it just resonates with me as a school psychologist because my role oftentimes was helping teachers identify these evidence-based, research-based interventions, practices, programs that they could use with students. And the truth is, there's not always evidence or research that says something works or doesn't work, right? There certainly are a lot of things that do, and those are the ones that are tried and true, and model fluent reading, things that show have research that say that they're impactful and that they work. Those should be our go-to. But I worked a lot at the secondary level, and as you all know, if you work at the secondary level, there's certainly a lot less research on these evidence-based programs at the secondary level. And I just always imagine a teacher perhaps that I worked with saying this to a student, who needed help with a specific skill deficit. They never did that, thankfully, because that would have been an issue. But I think there were some teachers who likely would have or wanted to, and I certainly understand because we don't always have the research support that we need. So my thought on this, and I think this makes sense, I think, I guess you can judge for yourself, but that's one thing DBI I think allows for is it allows you to know if what you're doing is working or not, right? So I think if we have an evidence-based program, that's what we should be delivering to our students, right? But in the case where it's a very specific skill deficit and a very specific situation, perhaps it's a multi-language learner, that's has some really specific needs that, the research just doesn't focus on, then I think if you're willing to provide what you think is best practice, close enough to the research, and you commit to letting the data that you collect drive your instruction and your decision making, then you're almost kind of creating your own evidence base, right? Because you might end up with data that says this kid is skyrocketing with what I'm doing. And if that's the case, then keep doing it, right? I think, again, you have to just be willing to then commit to the data that you're collecting and of course, allowing that data to drive your instruction, okay? All right, so this all, again, pertains to that first step of DBI. I went back a slide, really laying that foundation, okay? That validated intervention program that's delivered with fidelity, okay? If we're not doing that, then we can't do the rest of the steps of DBI, okay? Thankfully, you guys all are likely required to educate students who are coming into your classroom, okay? So as long as we're doing something close to that, we can sharpen what that first foundational step of DBI might look like, okay? Okay, so moving into step 2 is progress monitoring, okay? And step 2, what this slide says is develop a progress monitoring plan that includes an ambitious goal. All right. So, we always want to set ambitious goals for our students, and then we want to commit to collecting data to determine if they're making progress towards that goal, right? I think a lot of people get hung up on the term progress monitor. All it really is monitoring progress, right? I feel like maybe it should change the order of the words. And you're really just, I think the other way to simplify it is you're really just using that data to determine the effectiveness of that validated intervention program, which is why it's, if you can see my cursor, so closely connected to that validated intervention program. Okay. I think we have some slides that get into this, but you'll also notice that this is also connected to two other items here that I want to unpack. Okay. So the first one we'll go to the left here is non-responsive. Okay. So if the progress monitoring data that we're collecting indicates to us that a student is non-responsive, then we're going to continue through this DBI process. And we're going to get to that next step in just a minute. Okay, so we'll come back to that. But if the progress monitoring data indicates that the student is responsive, okay, so the progress monitoring data looks good, it's showing that the student's making adequate progress to meet that ambitious goal that we set for them, then we just continue on, right? This just becomes a loop, if you will. Okay, so we progress monitor, they're responsive. If they're responsive, then we continue to progress monitor. If the data says continually that they're responsive, then we just continue to progress monitor. Okay, it becomes a loop that frankly is a good thing. Okay, it just means that what we're doing at the most basic level of DBI is working, and that's good, because there's going to be students that's not going to happen for, and so we'll leave a lot of our other support for those kids. Okay. All right. So this is what it might look like. I always like to include a couple slides of perhaps what it might look like as you're progress monitoring. Okay. So this would be our baseline data point. This would be this ambitious goal that we set for a student. This solid line is what we would call an aim line, okay? Meaning this is kind of the aim or the trajectory that a student needs to be on to get from where they started to get to where they need to be at the end, okay? And then as we collect progress monitoring data, right, which is what we're collecting is related to the instruction that they're receiving, we're going to be able to determine the effectiveness of that instruction that they're receiving. Okay. And if it looks great, which in this case I would say it does, then we just keep on. Okay. And there's a couple different ways to break down progress monitoring data, but overall, from a visual analysis perspective, this looks good. Okay, so this would be that plus sign. This student is responsive. You can see that here. If yes, we move back to step one and we continue to provide that validated intervention and continue to monitor progress. It just becomes a circular cycle, if you will. All right. But we also know sometimes that's not what happens, right? And so here we have data that looks much different. The goal is the same. The baseline is the same. But the data that we're collecting on our student is not the same. Okay, and this data is indicating that a student is certainly not on track to meet that ambitious goal. So we're going to move to that next step of DBI. Okay, we also can look at data behaviorally, and so I've got two slides that look at that. Okay, I don't want to get too much into this because, again, we could have a whole session on data analysis. And so this is just very high level. Okay. But essentially we have one phase of data collection that looks not so great. Okay. This is engage time with academics. So you can see as we entered a new phase of our intervention, that certainly increased, right? This just means they're spending more time. And this is kind of the goal that we had set for the student, okay? So we would have some sort of decision rules that allows us to determine, is this adequate progress or not? In this case, I would say, yes, this very much is adequate progress. The intervention that we're providing for behavior for this student's intensive need is effective. So let's just continue to do that. We'll continue to collect progress monitoring data. So as we wrap up step 2, progress monitoring, I think as a summary, I would just say the progress monitoring is what moves you through the steps of DBI. okay? And that should make sense because we talked about how DBI is a data-driven process. And if you're not willing to commit to really allowing data to drive the decisions that you make, you cannot do DBI, okay? You cannot have preconceived, this is what this kid can do, this is what this kid cannot do. That all goes out the window with DBI, okay? DBI is committing to, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to commit to a process of collecting data and allowing that data to tell me what's best for my kids. That's really what it amounts to, all right? So that's kind of the summary on progress monitoring. All right, DBI step 3, why didn't the intervention work? Okay, so as I alluded to earlier, we move to the third step of DBI when we have a student who is non-responsive, okay? So again, we provided a tier 2 intervention, or perhaps we provided the IEP that we all agreed upon. And as we continue to collect progress monitoring data in the IEP or in that MTSS RTI process, the data is saying that they're a non-responder, okay? So the third step of DBI is really designed to help us answer the question, why didn't the intervention work, okay? So what we do at the third step is we want to collect some informal diagnostic data to help us develop a hypothesis, okay? You'll notice hypothesis is bold. That's because that's all it is, right? It's frankly a guess, okay? It's frankly a shot in the dark. That's really what it is, okay? And that's okay because, again, we're continuing to commit to allowing data to drive our decision making. So we'll know if we're wrong, and if we're wrong, that's okay because we're trying, okay? We're doing what's best for kids because we're actually trying to change this instruction that they're receiving. All we really know is it's not working. What we don't know is what will work. So we're going to make an informed hypothesis that might tell us what type of change to their instruction is necessary. All right. That's really what step 3 is about. Okay. So one thing I want to point your attention to now, because we have we have currently gone through 2 of these circles that look identical. They're green. They're probably ovals is the proper term, not circles. What that means is when you see a green oval, that's a data collection step, okay? So diagnostic data is about the process of collecting informal data, okay? And really the key is informal. And I mean that like from a school psychologist perspective, this is not where we, get consent and do a Woodcock-Johnson or a Wexler, a K-bit. That's formal. Okay, we're not that formal in this step, okay? This is informal, and I'll show you what I mean by that. I think I have a slide that kind of briefly mentions that, okay? But really, what we're trying to get at here is answering the question, why is the student not responding? We know from the last step that they're not. Now we need to answer the question, why, okay? All right. I should mention too, Alexa, I can't see the chat, so if something does come in, feel free to jump in. Okay. So, for example, we talked about the integration of academics and behavior. You guys likely can look at this and equate it to a student that you know, right? So perhaps we know a student that has a skill deficit. That skill deficit oftentimes can lead to avoidance behavior, which then could lead to removal from the task, which can then lead to a greater skill deficit, which just becomes this circular issue, okay? And that's where, as we think about diagnostic data, we have to consider all things, right? Like we might have a student who we're collecting data on their academics, but frankly, they might have a underlying behavioral issue that, perhaps is, the function of the behavior is avoidance or escape. And somehow, some way, and you guys know kids like this, every period or every class that you have that kid, they find a way to get out of whatever you're asking them to do. Well, that's just frankly a removal from the task, which just compounds the skill deficit. Okay. So when I say diagnostic data, I'm talking about all things, right? I'm talking about if we can break down the academic piece further in a diagnostic way, let's do that. But oftentimes it also means breaking down, even their behavior in a sense. Okay. Again, we could do a whole, probably full day on the different dimensions of, how to use diagnostic data to develop a hypothesis. Okay. So we're not getting into the specifics of that. Okay. But I do want to kind of give you a case scenario, if you will, of what this could look like. All right. So we had a student who was not progressing with that validated step 1 intervention program. Again, the data said that they were not progressing, so we're at this diagnostic step of why. Why are they not progressing? So here's kind of a case example. The teacher reviews the classroom assessment data and conducts observations of the student's learning behavior. As you can see, that's very informal. In fact, it's probably something that you all do every day. Okay, it's not something that you have to work very hard at obtaining. Behavior observations suggest that the student struggles to master skills as quickly as the student's same age peers and needs more practice than their peers. Okay, excuse me. So the hypothesis is, if the student is provided additional opportunities of direct instruction, feedback, and practice on target skills, then the student would move to mastery of these skills more quickly. Okay, now, do we know that that's going to work? No, we really don't. But we have reason to believe, based on this informal diagnostic data that we collected, that it could, right? And so as it pertains to adapting the intervention that we're currently providing, it makes sense then to adapt in that way. Okay, so again, there are several dimensions of how we can adapt. Again, that's a whole another thing to unpack, but this would just be an example of increasing the dosage. Think about it like medication, okay? Some people only need 2 doses of a certain medication. Some people need 5 or 10, right? It just depends on your individual characteristics. And that's what we mean by dosage, specifically as it pertains to a student that needs additional opportunities of direct instruction. We only know that because of the diagnostic data that we collected. Okay. All right, so let's move to this slide, because we do have tools that help us analyze informal diagnostic data. Okay, this handout that I provided at the State Department is just something that's on our website. Hopefully in the last 10 minutes, which I know we're getting close to, I can navigate to the website and you guys can at least see what that looks like. You can poke around. I promise you, most of the people that I hear from later on that I tell them about the website, there is something on the website that they utilize because there's a lot of stuff on there. Okay. All right. So this is a great tool because I think a lot of teachers, even honestly, a lot of school psychologists struggle with this idea of, how do I adapt? Okay, and that's the next step that we're going to get into. But you don't know how to adapt unless you know why the problem occurs. And that's the diagnostic data step. Okay, so again, summary for diagnostic data. It's trying to determine where the breakdown is. And I want you to know that we have a lot of resources on our website that facilitate this, help you, allow you to do this. Okay. All right. It's hard to talk about this step 4 it's hard to not talk about step 4 when you're talking about step 3, because they're so just interconnected. So I've already talked a lot about step 4 already, which is what change is needed. Okay. So again, we are collecting this diagnostic data that's telling us why the student is non-responsive to the first step of DBI. And that diagnostic data forces us to create a hypothesis, and that hypothesis is going to drive the adaptation to the intervention that we're providing. Okay. So step 4 is just intensify and individualize the interventions to address the hypothesis. Okay. So you can see now this is where the intensification, the individualization comes to play, right? Because we started with a validated intervention program that we already know research says isn't going to work for every kid. But if we provide it, collect data, determine why it's specifically not working, now we can individualize it. We can intensify it specific to that student's individual needs, and then continue to make a determination if that's making a difference. Okay. So this is just another resource that's on our website about adapting the intervention. Okay, so this is tips for successful intensification. So I've already mentioned this. You would want to select strategies that address the hypothesis. Okay, so like again, if a student, as we observed, we realize they need more time, well then, however we then adapt what we're actually providing to the student should be linked to what was uncovered in that hypothesis. Okay, again, step 3 and step 4 are holding hands. Okay, they're very connected. You might just select a few important strategies, right? Like we don't want to just overwhelm ourselves and the students with all of these different adaptations, right? In fact, I think it's really best to just choose one adaptation and determine if that alone is making a difference. And I'll talk to you in a second about how we know if that adaptation is making a difference. And then, you can consider easier changes first, right? Like increasing the dosage. So instead of, providing the intervention for 10 minutes, maybe we're going to do it for 15 or 20 minutes. Okay. Maybe the length of the sessions or the duration. Okay. I think those are all kind of the same thing. Maybe perhaps decreasing group size. Maybe they need more individualized access. And then decreasing the heterogeneity of the intervention group, meaning we need to make it look more similar to kids that have these specific types of needs, not kids that have a diversity of needs. All right. Okay, and then just a couple slides here on implementation monitoring. Was the adapted intervention delivered with fidelity? So we do have these fidelity tools on our website as well. And as we provide an intervention, but then even more as we individualize it, intensify it, we still have to deliver it with fidelity. And so we have a lot of really cool resources that allow you to check that the intervention that you're providing is in fact delivered with fidelity. Okay. I want to try to get through this last step very quickly because I think it's very similar to step 2, right? It's just kind of later on in the process, if you will. So step 5 is then just response to the adaptation, right? So this progress monitoring is now looking at, is the validated intervention program with the adaptation, so maybe more time, maybe a smaller group size, is that making a difference, right? So now what's the effectiveness of the intervention with the adaptation along with it, okay? And again, if the student's non-responsive, then what we would do is go back to diagnostic data again, right? And again, I've seen some educators who have done DBI for a long time, and they've made 5 or 6 adaptations. And I think for a lot of teachers, that sounds like too much, and it sounds maybe overwhelming. But the fact of the matter is you all do this stuff anyway, right? I mean, you all are racking your brains all the time trying to figure out what's the secret sauce for this kid. Well, the answer is we don't know, but a systematic process like DBI can help you figure that out. It can help you do that. I just have one more slide that I want to show, and then I'll open it up for questions. So this is kind of what we looked at a progress monitoring graph earlier. This is what it could look like as we continue to move through the steps of DBI, right? So we still have the baseline, we still have the goal score, and we have that aim line. This was this initial implementation perhaps of the IEP. We know that they're flatlining. What we're doing is not effective. They're not making any progress. And so, as you all know, we then are required to make some sort of change. So we would then adapt, right? Perhaps it's just increasing the dosage, the frequency, whatever the hypothesis indicates would be a good adaptation. We do that. And then we continue to collect progress monitoring data, which again is that 5th step. And then we allow this data to then help us make a determination. Much like before, if they're making progress, then we just stick with that intervention with those adaptations. If they're still not making adequate progress, then that's an indicator where we might need to go back and ask ourselves again, what is still perhaps not working for this child, and what else may we need to do? Okay. I know that was a lot, and I know, it forced you to really unpack a lot there, but hopefully that's a kind of a good foundational, DBI, why is it necessary, and what are those steps? So Alexa, I'm going to see if you have any questions, and then if anyone in the chat has questions, I'd be happy to answer anything that anybody's thinking through.
Sounds great. Yes, I do have a couple of questions. Just as we're thinking about all of these processes and what you've described, would you say that DBI is maybe difficult to implement if you've not started it before?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I think it's always important to be very honest about the work that's required to do DBI. And I think more than anything, it just really requires a commitment to the process. What I have seen is teachers who do commit to doing it, what they realize is they were doing a lot of this work anyway. It's like I said a second ago, you all work with students who you're trying to really figure out what is going to help them most. DBI is just a process that makes it systematic, right? I mean, I think it allows you to really put steps to a process to how to work with these students. So I do think in the beginning, it can seem difficult, and I think it's worth being honest about that and saying that, it's just like anything else that's new. But I think when we look at the time that we spend trying to figure out right now what we do for students, I think if you can commit to the process, familiarize yourself with it, start with a few students, then I think, it becomes less burdensome, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think, trying something new, trying the next step, can take a lot of that additional practice and that additional starting point, but really having the opportunity to see it work and see it effective is going to be really beneficial for kind of leaning into that additional practice. So just as a question for many of the educators that you've worked with, what do they say about DBI and how has it changed their work?
Yeah, good question. And I think you kind of alluded to that, Alexa, and it makes me think, so that presentation that we did at CEC, we also have it recorded and it's on our website. And so if we have a minute, I do want to jump to the website. But it was a great presentation, not because of NCII, but because we had a panel of educators that we've worked with through NCII that fill many of the roles that I think people on the call today do. And so they were actually talking about how DBI has impacted their work. And many of them would tell you, I think what I just said is, it perhaps felt difficult to get started, but then I think what you alluded to, Alexa, is then they start to see the fruit of the systematic process, right? Where, they understand that they're going to provide an intervention, they commit to collecting data, and then they commit to letting that data drive the next steps, right? And so, I think that they've adapted a lot of what they've done with students, and they have seen through adapting the work that they typically do, that those adaptations really have made a difference for their students. So if I can point you in that direction, I'd be happy to do that. If nothing else, Alexa, I could share that with you, and then perhaps you could share it out where, they could watch, even if it's just like the last 20 minutes of this webinar, where you could actually hear from educators. Because I know I can talk about DBI and make it sound like it's the greatest thing on the earth. But when you really hear from people who are working with students, I think it means more. And I think they would tell you over time, it's something that they couldn't do without it now, honestly.
Absolutely. If you could give one tip on how to get started, what would that tip be?
Yeah, that's important, especially as, perhaps you're moving to DBI. And frankly, I think it's just start small, right? I mean, maybe just identify one kid on your caseload that you really want to use this systematic process. Again, I think if you think about a lot of kids on your caseload, you're going to see where what you're already doing fits into these steps. But I think if you really want to go about it and be really structured and do it with fidelity, I would say start very small, and see what kind of changes you can make with that individual single child, and then go from there, right? So I think the key in really starting DBI and doing it with fidelity is start small. It's okay to go slow. Do it right. I'd rather see people do it right than to halfway do it. And then what we hear sometimes is, well, this didn't work. And it's like, well, because you didn't really commit to doing it the right way. It's kind of an all or nothing kind of thing. So that would be my recommendation.
Absolutely. Well, you had mentioned the access to these materials. So all of these materials will be located on our SPIDEG implementation course, including the recording and the slide deck. And then any of the materials that you'd like us to link out, we can link to that same kind of what this session has been about. So any of those pieces. We do have about a minute. You're welcome to stay for a little longer if you need to showcase where the materials are on the website. And if anybody needs to jump off, the rest of the recording and the links will be available for you.
Yeah, I'll just quickly do this. I don't want to keep anybody longer. So our website is just intensiveintervention.org. So you can just type that in any URL bar and get there. But you can see, right, just from the very beginning, a lot of like the things that we've already unpacked today. But we have all kinds of helpful information. So about DBI, you could start there. The DBI process, again, we talked a lot about that. I think one thing for, if this is new to you, which I'm assuming it is for many of us, maybe even just getting started with DBI, right? So readiness and capacity building. We have voices from the field. So like I said, if you want to hear from people who are actually doing DBI and not, somebody who's just talking about DBI, you can certainly do that as well. We have a lot of training materials. We actually have a workshop this afternoon that I'm leading. If you wanted to click here and you could register for that. This is specific where we're really going to break down progress monitoring. So again, there's just all kinds of resources here. I think one of the helpful things is you can search, so if you're really just wanting to look at adaptation or adaption, I guess you have to type it right. And I don't know if that's, there we go. So, if you're something specific you're looking for, you could even search for it, which I think is, a helpful feature of a website. So that's really all I had. Again, I know that's a lot to unpack, but I certainly wanted to introduce you all to this concept. And then I think as we move forward with how we're moving in the state, hopefully you'll learn more about DBI, have an opportunity to learn more about DBI. So I appreciate everybody's time and attention. And I'm happy to help in any way I can moving forward.
Thank you so much, Kyle. This was fantastic. You had a lot of great feedback in the chat. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining. This will be our last community of practice until we pick them up again in the fall. Have a great rest of your school year and a great summer. And we'll see you all next year.
Thanks.